hit record. Okay. Well, welcome HGSC alumni to our first summer reading event of 2023. I'm Lisa Himmelman, the Assistant Director of Alumni Engagement, and we're delighted to have you join us today. So before we get into it, I do have some light housekeeping items that I want to review with all of you. As you can see, we're hosting today's session in a meeting style, so feel free to keep your camera on or turn it off, whichever is your preference. And you can also see that I hit the record button. We are recording today's session and distributing it next week via email to everybody who registered. You'll notice that you're currently muted, and we do ask that you remain muted when you're not speaking. This is meant to be an interactive session though, so everyone here will have the opportunity to raise their hands, go off mute to ask questions, and have discussion later on in the session. We also invite you to use the chat for this purpose, and we will be moderating the chat. We'd love to get a sense of who's here today. So please put into the chat your HGSC degree, your or degree program or concentration, where you're joining us from, and your current role. We also have closed captioning available for today's session. So if you would like to see the captions, please click on the CC/live transcript button, then click on show subtitle. You can turn off subtitles by clicking on live transcript, then click hide subtitle. And then finally, if you have any technical questions or issues, please feel free to reach out to me or to Emily Williams in the chat, and we'll be happy and try to help you troubleshoot as best we can. So now on to the good stuff. I am thrilled to introduce today's speaker and facilitator, HGSC Senior Lecturer on Education and Faculty Co-Chair of the Education Policy and Analysis Program, Carrie Conaway. We're excited to feature Carrie's book, Common Sense Evidence, the Education Leader's Guide to Using Data and Research during this session. So take it away, Carrie. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Lisa, and hi, everyone. Nice to see you all. I'm thrilled to be here today at my office and getting to meet some folks. It looks like many of you were here. I joined the faculty in 2019, and I see at least some of you are from before my era, so nice to meet all of you. And if I've met you while you were here, then nice to see you. So I want to talk about my book. I realized I should have had a copy. Here's my book, Common Sense Evidence. And the way I want to do this is to talk about asking and answering questions, because that's really just central to the work of using evidence in your practice. I want to begin to have you all think about what is a question related to your work that you'd like to know the answer to. And so pick something that could be answered with data or research rather than opinion. And I would love it if you would just chat those in as you think of questions, because later on, I'm going to come back and take a look at those and we can talk about what type of question they are and what sort of answer we might look for. So I invite you to put those in the chat while I get organized on my slides, because I gotta share. I was saying this is reminding me of teaching on Zoom. It's been a little while since I've done this, but here we go. Okay, I can see that, and I think I can see at least some of you all. I cannot see the chat, however. Wait, I gotta figure out what's going on with my chat. Aha, okay. Great. All right, so a question related to your work that you'd like to know the answer to that can be answered with data or research in the chat as we're going. Today, I want to focus on this issue of asking and answering questions with data. And I'm going to begin by telling you a story about the very first question I got asked in my old job. I was, for about 12 years, I was the research director for the State Department of Education in Massachusetts. So here in Massachusetts. And I started in 2007. Back then, my boss, literally on my first day of work, my boss asked me what seems like a fairly simple question: what is the impact of Boston charter schools? This is Jeff Nellhouse was his name. He was very interested in this issue because at that point the state had, probably 10 or more years history working with charter schools. And they were very interested to know, how do kids do if they end up in a charter school relative to a traditional school in the city of Boston? And we had, at the time that I arrived, we had some researchers interested in answering the question. We had a foundation willing to fund the research, but my job was to figure out how to actually get that research done. So just to put some context into the environment I was walking into, like I said, we were like a decade into education reform, a big initiative that started in the early 1990s here in Massachusetts. So we were using a lot of data to ask questions about school and district performance for things like school accountability, which also made, I think, people open to the idea of using data for our own work. We had a really strong commissioner and a strong deputy, generally pretty good relationships with the senior staff in the agency. So people internally felt comfortable using data as part of their improvement strategy. But we didn't have a lot of like structure in place about how to do that. And so that was what my role was to help people use data to learn. So Jeff asks me this question: what is the impact of Boston charter schools? Where we began was, we have this research team that are like among the nerdiest imaginable people. Here's my data nerds. They are like, you know, researchers tend towards the nerdy to begin with, but these guys are like off on the tail end of the distribution. They're extremely competent, really excellent technical, don't have a lot of experience interacting with practitioners as part of how they do their work. And then we have the practitioners on the other side, my colleagues in the charter school office, who are trying to actually run the charter school program. They are really interested to know whether charter schools have a positive impact on kids' outcomes, but they don't have the research tools to answer those questions. They had tried to answer it in different ways, but the big challenge in answering this type of question is dealing with the fact that the kids who go to charters self-selected to go. Either they or their parents chose to send them there. And so they are probably different than students who would just be like, if you just randomly assign students to charter schools. And so you have to be thoughtful about how you manage that issue if you're going to answer that question. And they were the practitioners did not have a lot of experience with that. So I've got researchers on one side, practitioners on the other, and then here's me in the middle, trying to work between these two groups of people to figure out the right questions to ask and how to use the answers. So we start embarking on this research project. It took us, I don't know, a year and a half or something to get to the point of having data to the researchers, letting them, having them able to actually run some analysis. They actually, for a while, the impact, as it turns out, is so large that they were afraid they'd made a mistake. It was such a huge impact relative to what was happening in the traditional schools at that time. So, fast forward that 18 months or whatever, we finally have the answer. The impact is on the order of like a quarter of a standard deviation a year. So roughly speaking, kids who are attending Boston charters were gaining an extra year of learning for every year they attended those schools, meaning that in 3 or 4 years, the achievement gap would be totally closed. So this is pretty astonishing, right? This is a quite large, especially at that time, one of the largest impacts ever seen of a study along these lines. And it generated a lot more questions. We had only looked at Boston. Is this true statewide, or is this just a Boston thing? Is this true for all groups of students? Why and how are charter schools generating these results? Not just what is the impact, but why and how. And we kept asking questions, and the researchers kept answering them. And ultimately, this yielded a research partnership that continues to this day, working on related issues about the impact of choice around the state. So we create this research partnership, but more important is that the ongoing injection of research from the partnership also helped us create and sustain some of the routines around how to use research and how we ask and answer questions. So remember, I said at the beginning, this was the big thing that was missing in the agency. They had the willingness and interest in using data and evidence to inform their work, but didn't have a lot of routines and structures and practices that help them sustain that. And this started with the charter school project. We ended up doing this with lots of different policy areas, so you can kind of imagine it growing and growing over time. And I later read some academic work that helped me understand why we were able to do this successfully at the agency. So I'm going to share that briefly with you. Oh, sorry, this is just what the report looked like. 3 elements of learning organizations. You need to have a supportive learning environment. So a place that is willing to ask questions about its own performance and willing to use evidence and data to help improve outcomes. You need leadership that reinforces that by, for example, setting aside time for self-reflection, asking people to self-assess and review, setting an expectation that that is part of a professional behavior, not something that is viewed as negative. And you need those concrete learning practices. And so what I learned in short really is oh, sorry, I meant to flip ahead. I meant to flip ahead to the very important role that I sort of inadvertently found myself in. This in-between role actually has a name in the research literature. It's called a research broker or a boundary spanner, someone who's kind of working between 2 professions or fields or groups or communities and being able to help connect them and bring them together to do something. And so this type of role and the type of skills you need for that role are really essential to the way data and evidence get used in practice, but it's not something that people realize. People thought oh, if you just do a research study, then practitioners will use the findings. And really research use is social, and you need to be able to create social moments and ways in which people have an opportunity to interpret, make meaning from, apply to their own context. And so what I learned from all this really is that integrating research and data into practice is really a lot more than just plunking down a bunch of data and hoping people use it. But if you can get that right, it can make a huge difference for the ability of organizations to use data well. And I can show you some evidence of how what the change looked like at DESE. This is a photo of an event that we did about 9 years after that first day of my job. It was the research team, the charter school research team came to me and said, we would like to put on a research conference about education policy issues in Massachusetts. So first of all, it's their idea. It's not my idea. Then they say, and we don't want it to be a traditional research conference. We want the researchers to be presenting, but then usually what happens at a research conference is one nerd stands up and does all this super technical, here's all the details of everything I did. And then the discussant, there's a second person who stands up and tells them all the things they did wrong. And that's how a research conference rolls. They said, that's not what we want. Instead, we want the discussant to be a practitioner, someone who either maybe was involved in this project. It can talk about why they commissioned the project, how they used the results. Or maybe it's a practitioner who could talk about the implications that it would have for their work or something like that. So we have researchers and practitioners literally shoulder to shoulder working together to make meaning of research and apply it to context. And you can see it in this photo because going from left to right, this is Kate Lipper, who's at the Department of Higher Education. She was their general counsel, so she's a practitioner. Then we have Beth Schuler, who is a researcher who studies school choice and school governance. Cliff Chuang, who was the senior, or maybe the associate commissioner over the charter school office at this time. He had actually been an analyst in the charter school office on that very first study and had worked his way up over time, was in the senior leadership role. Here's Doug Harris, who's another researcher in this field. And then this head in the front is Chris Gabrielli, who actually ran for governor a few years before this photo was taken. And so you can just see right down the line, folks working together to make meaning from data. So this was a day that I knew that the work I was doing made a difference. I could see it, I could feel it in a way that's hard sometimes for these long-term change initiatives. And it's a great story about how asking and answering data and questions mattered in my agency. But I think the maybe more interesting question is, why is this type of experience so rare? My whole career has been in this space where it's about how research and data get used in policymaking. And I think a really big part of the problem, the big reason why there's so much disconnect between research and practice is it comes down to these two sentences. Practitioners solve problems and researchers answer questions. So if research is going to help you solve a problem, you have to figure out how to turn your problem into a question that a researcher can answer. And then you have to figure out how to get your question or your answer to the question to help you figure out the solution. And that is not trivial. That is not a trivial translation. It is actually quite challenging. And this is a big reason that Nora and I wrote the book, was to help people understand how to turn their problems into questions and how to evaluate, interpret, and apply the answers. So what I want to do for the next couple minutes is just talk about 3 types of questions that you might ask to help solve problems. And if you have not yet in the chat put your question you're interested in answering, I would invite you to do that now. I'm going to repost the prompt. A question you're interested in related to your work that could be answered with data rather than opinion. And because I want to go through this framework and then see how your questions might fit into the framework. So the first type of question you might come across, this is my book. The first type of question you might come across is a diagnostic question. Is the problem worse for or when a certain thing is true? Let me give you an example of what I mean. In Tennessee, they did a report, 8 years ago, where they looked at what are the school-based reasons why we're seeing kids be successful or not successful in terms of completing AP advanced placement courses and then performing well on the test. And so it could be the reason you would run that kids might not succeed on a test could be that the test isn't offered to them or it's too expensive for them to take. It could be that the course isn't offered at their school. It could be that the course is offered, but there aren't enough students that are well prepared academically for the course. And so you could imagine all the different reasons why it might be the case that you would see potentially some schools doing better than others in terms of percent of kids who pass an AP test. And the thing that's really important about that is the policy solution is so different, right? If the policy issue is that kids can't afford the test, then you come up with a program to help cover the fees for the test. If the issue is that the schools aren't offering the AP, then that's a different problem. If it's that the kids aren't academically prepared, it's yet a different problem. So it's really important to actually make sure you're solving the right problem. And that's where the questions of diagnosis come in. Now, some key things to think about with this. When I think about questions that are worse for, questions like that are like worse for what group of students? Worse for maybe kids with disabilities or kids from low-income families or things like that. And that's useful to a point, but it ends up often really, as some people use this phrase, admiring the problem, right? So you're just breaking down by the same subgroups you always look at. You're like, oh, same groups are doing bad again. And it doesn't help point you to solutions. So I would really urge you to think about worse when questions. Is it worse when kids who want to take AP courses are at a school that doesn't have a late bus so they can't stay afterwards for tutoring or something like that? Is it that kids who were assigned to less effective educators were less likely to be successful on AP tests? Is it, any of a number of things you could think of that are in the system of schools and things that are under your control, right? You have some ability to change the bus schedule or who's assigned, which teacher assigned to which kid, or the other resources available in the system. And that will help you see the solution if you can ask a question about an inequity in resource or access. So what I've seen sometimes when I've gone through this type of exercise with practitioners is that they will quickly start to point to poverty or racism or issues like that as being the reason why the problem is worse, which is undoubtedly true. but is not something that is under the immediate control of a school, and it just leaves you to throw up your hands and be like, there's nothing that can be done about it. When meanwhile, you could change how you assign teachers to students. You could change which schools have the most AP courses available to them, those kinds of issues. So that's one thing to think about with diagnostic questions. Second kind of question is implementation. Did we implement our improvement strategy as we had thought? So when we think about implementation, I think that to me that falls under, or two things fall under that. One is resources and one is activities. What are the resources we need in order to actually implement our strategy? Did we have them available to ourselves? While, were we able to garner the resources needed to do this? And then activities, did we actually do what we said we were going to do? So an example of where a resource might be missing, and that's an issue, is like maybe you picked a strategy that would work great in a large urban district, and maybe there's even research evidence to suggest it, but you are in a small rural district, and the strategy just doesn't translate. You don't have the right resources in your community to pull off that strategy. So it's important to think about as a way of understanding why and how you are getting the outcomes you're getting. You need to understand something about the system that's producing them, and that's why implementation questions are so important. To understand, like, are you envisioning that there's supposed to be a set of resources available that just aren't there, or a set of activities? A classic thing we used to do at the agency frequently, if you thought about like the theory of action for an initiative, it would be like, commissioner tells superintendents to do this thing, superintendents tell teachers to do this thing, and then it happens. And like, there's a lot of work happening between that superintendent and that teacher that you better make sure is happening, because if you don't get the result you're expecting, you're going to wonder why. And it's probably somewhere in that magical, like, superintendents will just magically make teachers do things, part of your theory of action. Okay, third type of question is impact questions. Impact is more about, did our strategy actually work? And what do I mean by that? I think, what do we mean by work? Like, to me, that means it meaningfully improved outcomes for the people we had intended. Impact questions are actually among the hardest to ask. They're usually the very first ones practitioners ask. Is my work having an impact? That's what we started with the charter school study. If you want to answer these really well and convincingly, it's very hard, because you often have to deal with the fact that whoever is participating in your initiative that you want to know if it worked probably wasn't randomly assigned to it, got chosen in some way. And how do you account for that? And how do you account for the fact that it's probably lots of different things influencing their outcomes, not just this one particular program or initiative you're interested in? So those are my three categories of questions. And I'm going to stop sharing for a second so I can see you and the questions and see what we've come in with. So I think up earlier, we had, Aaron had one, whether your EDIB efforts are impacting STEM applicants and enrollment from underserved populations. Okay, so what Aaron wants to know is, they've got some, I'm assuming this is a higher ed context, and that she's interested to know, we're putting a lot of effort into trying to increase the diversity of our applicant pool and who enrolls. Is that actually having an impact on STEM applicants and enrollment? Aaron, I welcome you if you would like to jump in and add on that. You feel free to just unmute yourself. We're not a large group.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been so helpful so far. Obviously, we can just kind of look at year over year data on the kind of breakdown, but I feel like that's not really telling us the whole story. And it's one of those things that I feel like your head might continue to nod at this. It seems so funny. It's like, I feel like everybody understands the importance of data-informed decision-making. It's like the forefront of our mind, but it always feels like we can't kind of get aligned on how. And I really appreciate the framing you have, because sometimes my biggest question is like, are we looking at the right data sets to get the kind of 10,000 foot view we're trying to get? Because I think just looking at the breakdown doesn't really tell us like, how is our outreach and we've often thought about too, like how would be the best way to maybe talk to those people who don't choose, right, our school, to kind of understand what those drivers were. So there's a lot of, just like when you were talking about earlier, the charter school choice, there's a lot of like variables that we have to consider to understand, is this the real clear picture? And how do we adjust our methods if not?
Yeah. Yeah. And this kind of question is really hard to answer. And, you know, I, in the other part of my job, I run admissions for our policy program. So I have very similar questions around how exactly that shows up in our work. And as I was saying right before we went into this section, the impact questions are the hardest ones of all, because for to your point, Erin, that you have like, you're missing information from a bunch of students that you would like to know. Why didn't you apply or enroll? It's very hard to gather that information. And you might see an improvement, but then you don't know, well, is it just that it's improving everywhere? Or is it something that we did specifically? So this type of question, we actually spend quite a bit of time on in the book, because it is so commonly asked and because it is so hard to answer. So more time probably than we have time to fully get into the details today, but just know that there's stuff there for you if you're interested in an impact question. And also, you know, if you were to ask a traditional academic researcher an impact question, they would say what you should do is something like a randomized control trial, like where you randomly assign some people to get the diversity initiative outreach or whatever it is, and some not. And you can do that sometimes, but it's not always possible. And so we offer some suggestions for what you can do if you can't run a randomized control trial, but you do want a really strong answer to this question. At the state, I literally never ran a randomized control trial in 12 years of working as the research director there, because they are so hard to pull off in practice. So we wanted to make sure we offered some stuff for people that wanted those kind of questions answered, but couldn't do it in that venue. All right, so we had an impact question. Let's see what else I've gotten here. Okay, Francis, I think, did I see, are you still here?
I am.
Oh, there you are. So you're interested, are we serving all of our students with, tell me a little bit more about your question.
Trying to track, we do a lot of, my department does a lot of, interventions for students, and really trying to make sure that we are providing the supports needed to start into the high school, providing those interventions, during the year. And my department's been tracking, kids on the DF list every week, number of teachers who refer kids, who are those kids, what are those kids' names? And I feel like we're deep in the weeds, and there are a lot of different data pieces I think that would help us to solve this, but ultimately that's the question I want the answer to.
Right. And so you're what I hear from that is that you're interested in your own context, and you've got lots of stuff going on, and you're trying to figure out, can I trace a thread through all those things to some sort of like effective service, whatever that is. And it might be different for different types of kids or different types of initiatives, but you're kind of taking a global view of like, do we have the right set of strategies in place? Yeah,
That's right. Because I can't, it's a private school, and I can't necessarily aggregate the attendance data, the behavior data, any other pieces of the puzzle. So I'm just trying to focus on the academic piece of it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's interesting. So you're not able to connect the academics with like behavior data or attendance or anything?
No, I mean, our systems are not great at tracking. The deans don't want to share the academic data, just like, or the referral data. It's kind of weird, even though we all have the same mission and want to serve kids. It's funny sometimes how the internal politics of schools work. So I can focus on the academics, and I'm trying to collect data just anecdotally to add to kind of what we have.
Yep. Well, I mean, that goes back to what I was talking about with the idea of a learning organization, that what you just described, people not wanting to share data does not sound like a supportive learning environment, right?
Yeah, right.
And that's sort of the first barrier. Like, you'll never get to the point of people being really richly able to use data until you can set those conditions in place.
Yeah. Is it possible to, within my own department, collect data and just go ahead without them?
Yeah, absolutely. that was what I did when I first started at the agency, was sort of like the coalition of the willing approach, you know?
Yes.
So, and demonstrating the value of using that approach then gets other people on board, you know, but sometimes you have to have some examples of what it would look like tangibly. So in my case, it was this charter school study, and then our board chair at that time had a particular initiative that he was very supportive of. And so working with the woman who was in charge of implementing that and being like, you know, he's going to ask you for data in a year. Why don't we plan for it now instead of scrambling, you know,
Right.
9 months from now to pull that together? So trying to be like either where I knew there was interest, or I knew that it was very likely there was going to be somebody visible asking for data.
Yes. Yes.
And then expanding from there. So
In order to help me categorize this, is this an impact? Is my question an impact question?
I mean, I think so, yes. It's a little bit got elements of both.
Okay.
Because meaning both implementation and impact. In the end, I think what you're saying is like, did this stuff work?
Yeah.
But when I hear you say effectively serving, to me, that makes me think about what are the set of activities and resources that need to be in place in order to have that impact? And I might think about what questions I need to ask to convince myself that like the most important chunks are there.
Okay.
What I often do when I teach this in my class, and it's in the book as well, starting with the theory of action for your initiative and really being specific about what are the resources, what are the activities, what are the outcomes I'm expecting to see, and using that to create a learning agenda. So then you think like, all right, if it's essential, the only way I can pull this off is if I have enough school counselors to run the summer, whatever the heck program, you know? Then, and that they're well trained and have the skills they need, you know, then you can be like, all right, maybe what I need to do is do a survey of the school counselors, or maybe I need to interview 3 or 4 of them, or like you can think about what's your data collection strategy to answer the question. And I don't know, you don't need to be fancy. Like, we're not trying to get this published in an academic journal, right? We're just trying to like learn some stuff. So, so I think I've sometimes heard people describe that like the difference between people who are interested in proving things versus improving things. And I am firmly in improving camp.
Okay.
Whereas researchers tend to be more of a proving kind of thing. I don't think we have to prove that your program is academic. We just need to improve the program. So lower standard of evidence.
Thank you very much.
Okay, maybe I'll take 1 or 2 more. I see Chelsea's the next one down. So is the special ed programming helping students access IEPs and close gaps? Chelsea, would you like to tell us more? Are you here still?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, I am new to special education. So this is my first job that's SPED specific. Prior to this, I was an instructional coach and a dean at a charter school. And so a lot of this year has been just understanding some of the ways that we justify changing IEP goals or exiting students from IEPs, and have just really struggled to figure out from a district perspective, like how do I track data district wide to understand how we're doing and to like better know what shifts we need to make. So I know that's pretty broad, but I'm still doing a lot of learning, I would say.
Yeah. Well, special ed is one of those areas that's particularly challenging for this kind of thing because it's small numbers of students with often complex situations and needs, and it's hard to answer really precisely questions like this. But what's interesting to me here is like you could think about answering this question in 2 ways, because it could be specific to your district or your school, like the context you're in, much like Francis's question was sort of, does this set of things seem to have an impact? You could also think about it from the strategy of, are the strategies and stuff that we're choosing ones that have support in research evidence? Because if you're saying like, is our programming helping? Like, are we choosing strategies that have been proven elsewhere to help? It's a little bit like Christine has a question here too. What instructional practices make the biggest impact? That's not so much about what's happening in your school or district. It's more like, what do we know from research in the world that might help inform the strategies we choose? And we do try in the book to talk about how to evaluate other people's research, not just how to use your own data. because both of those things are valuable and useful. My experience is easier. If you don't have a lot of research training, it's easier to start with your own data because you know the context so well, and then kind of build out. But sometimes we come from the other direction. We're actually now, we're now requiring all of our master's students to take a course on evidence. That as one of the things I coordinate. And so they're learning a little bit about how to evaluate all the different forms of evidence that they're likely to encounter and how to apply them in their practice. So, and we have a little kind of like a short version of it in PPE right now. So if you're interested in learning more, it's funny. My book is sort of like, if I alone were in charge of teaching the evidence class, it would be this book. But when it's a group project, it's that course. That's how we ended up with that. So I don't know that I see here a diagnostic question, but I think you might, once you started to get into like the theory of action stuff, you might start to think like, oh, that's interesting. Why am I seeing this result? Is it because of this factor, this factor, this factor? And that would help you diagnose where's the system breaking down that's leaving kids out of whatever the result is you're trying to get to. So let me wrap up a little bit. I have just a few more thoughts and I'm happy to take additional questions. I'll just get back to my slides. Okay, so here's the 3 kinds of questions again. Diagnosis, implementation, impact. Here's the table of contents, just so you get a sense of what's in the book. And we build this all through, we use an example from a district, sort of a composite example, to show how this would look at each stage in a context. And the example we use is a district that's trying to improve its chronic absenteeism rates, which I'm sure many of you are working on because it's been a big priority. So you can sort of see how you would use data and research evidence in all of these steps along the way. But so there's a million tips in this book, and it's hopefully fairly practical. I think the most important tip is to stop and ask questions in the first place, which as educators, I think we are very thoughtful about planning our work. We are not always thoughtful about planning our learning. And I put myself in this category. My whole old job was reminding people to stop and plan your learning. I would, be working with all my colleagues around the agency and be like, what are the things that you're planning to do in the next year? How will we know if they've been implemented the way you want? How will we know if they're having a result? And then I came here, and my job is very different here. My job here is to be teaching and running programs. I'm much more of an implementer. I'm not a researcher here. And there I am sailing away, developing all my programs. And one of my colleagues who has the equivalent of my old job had to stop and be like, well, have you planned your learning from this? How are you going to know whether the program is going the way you expected it to? And I thought, oh my goodness, this is such a great example of how you can get so focused on just doing the programmatic work that you forget to take that pause and make sure you've planned your learning. So I know that data use can often feel like an extra or like a thing you don't have time for, but I just want to urge you all to find a little space to get a little bit more data, a little bit more research in your work, trying to think of it as really a form of learning. That's what all that is. That's all research is asking and answering questions a little bit more kind of in a more structured way. It's a form of learning. And I mean, what do educators love more than learning, right? So I hope that gives you a sense of what you might get out of reading my book if you have the opportunity to read it. And those are sort of the big ideas I've been thinking about and working on the last few years. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see you all again. I'm happy to take, I think we have about 20 minutes. I'm happy to take whatever questions. It doesn't have to be precisely on the topic of the book, just anything you're interested about. Oh, I see that there's a discount. That's nice. Thank you, whoever sponsored that. So, Erin, go ahead.
Yeah, I just am so enthusiastic about the kind of reminders you have here about setting up your learning and thinking about that. I feel like, so I work in Harvard, so just for context, and I feel like we do a lot of like surveys. And
Yep.
really always sure what we do with what comes back from those surveys. And so it's not a criticism, it's more of like as somebody who's starting to help think about assessment for some of our different areas. Like sometimes I'm trying to work backwards. Like there was recently a suggestion of like polling faculty on something, on just like their overall satisfaction. And so my question was like, well, let's work backwards, like not so much like influencing the data, like, but like, what are we hoping to do with that? Because if we're just going to ask people their general opinions and they're saying, well, we want more space and we can't just magically produce more space, right? Like what are we really drilling down to? And I'm wondering if like that's the right approach, and how do you, when you're working with interconnected teams, how do you get people, because there's a lot of like enthusiasm around assessment, but again, are we doing the right kinds of assessment to kind of really figure out what's going on?
Oh, yes. So I really like your thought of working backwards. One of the big things I always think with that, because we did a million surveys like this at my old job. This is very common. And I feel like rule number one is do not ask if you cannot act. Because you know what is worse than not asking somebody's opinion is asking somebody's opinion and then not acting on it. That's real bad. So that's rule number one, which means you have to be very thoughtful about, if you are going to do a survey, exactly how you phrase the question, what you do and don't ask, don't make it too long. I mean, all those things, don't make it too long. There's actually, there's a Harvard program on surveys or something like that has some great resources for how to write survey questions. But also, I found quite frequently that I would learn just as much from just calling a handful of people as I would from the whole logistical thing about a survey. And people like to talk about themselves. And so if you can get a half hour, even though the survey would probably take them 10 minutes and not a half hour, quite frequently people would much happily more take a half hour to tell you about their experience with XYZ than to fill out a survey. So it depends on what you're going to do with the data, right? If you need something that's like a representative sample, an interview is probably not going to be the right way to go. But you know, I think being thoughtful and creative about the best way to reach people where they are and gather data, it is not always a survey.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. I hope I get one fewer survey from you as a result. Other folks?
So Carrie, I'm interested, you know, in the work that I've done in schools. The data seems almost, it's not readily collected and analyzed. And there's a number of reasons for that. I mean, some of the educators I work with just aren't comfortable with that. What are you, as you're working in this field, are you finding that more schools and districts and leaders are adopting more systems to collect data and analyze it? Or is this, do you find that this is kind of a general kind of a resistance to data in the education field?
You know, I only have my own experience to go by. My agency where I work certainly, I think, got a lot better about this over time while I was there. And, you know, from a district perspective, sometimes the reason they're collecting data is because the state or the federal government told them they had to, right? So that stuff certainly has increased. For years, excuse me, at my agency, we had a rule of we only collect the data if the federal government says we have to, you know, was sort of our like buffer or whatever. But we got to a point that we just couldn't answer the questions we wanted to answer without understanding a little bit better just the systems and structures in schools. So things like which teachers are assigned to which kid, there's nothing in the federal government rules that says you have to collect that. But we needed it, and we needed to know which courses students were taking. And that was a big mindset shift we had to make, that it wasn't just for compliance, it was because we needed it in order to improve. To get over that hump, we had to demonstrate the value of the data we had for answering questions and its limitations, right? So it was a big effort to get to the point of being able to collect more systematic data, linked to student IDs often, you know, that all those sort of structural things that make it easy to analyze. So that's one big chunk of that work, is sort of the convincing people it's worth investing the time and effort. And then the thing that then, in my experience, tends to happen is then we collect the data and we don't use it because we don't have enough analytical capacity in the district. We had, thankfully, at the state, I was in Massachusetts again, and they tend to be sort of data oriented. So we did have quite a few analysts, but until I came, there was not a research team. So those analysts were all focused on send the federal reports in, or like in a district context, send the state report, that kind of analysis, not the more strategic, improvement oriented, longer term type of stuff. And it wasn't until they carved out a couple people to work on that we really started to get traction. And it goes back to those learning organization things, like you need some resources. It doesn't have to be staff in your district. It could be you bring in a research partner from a local university or a graduate student, or it could be maybe it's part of a teacher's job. Instead of teaching an extra course or two, they do analytics. Math teachers love this stuff, apparently, is my understanding. But it's got to be somebody's job at a certain point, or it's just not going to happen. Emily or Lisa, do you want me to answer the question that came in the pre-chat about, what was it, AI? I think it was, I have it written down, hang on. Somebody had sent in ahead of time a question about like, how will artificial intelligence affect our ability to use research and data? So
yeah, I'm happy to. The person who submitted it is not on this webinar, but we can certainly answer it for those watching the recording and for all of you. The question came in around AI. Let me just make sure I get it exactly the way that it was said here. Hold on.
sorry, Emily, I put you on the spot.
No, that's all right. I was wondering if you wanted to answer that question or not. So
Okay, and then Samantha, I see your hand. We'll come back to you. I don't want to distract Emily from.
I know. Well, why don't you take Samantha's, because my computer
okay.
is obviously being
All
slow.
right, Samantha, go ahead.
Hi, Carrie. Thanks for taking my question. When you started speaking about being a research broker, it just spoke to me in the role that I'm currently in. I work with a data team that analyzes all of our district data, synthesizes it, and then shares it publicly for external decision making. But we often take that same data internally and apply it to the most pressing questions for our district or issues that we have to solve for. I find that being the person that's in between the knowledge of the data and leadership, I often see how that decision making happens. And I wanted to know if you had any, suggestions or best practices on how to learn how to do this really effectively, especially when you're working with leaders who are also practitioners and come from a perspective of their experience might trump what the data is actually speaking to. And so there's a limitation on how much I can push what I am reading into the data because they might have already come in with like a preconceived notion.
Yep. Well, Samantha, I did not plan you asking this question, but I am so glad you asked it because I have another book that just came out, not through Harvard Education Press, on this very topic. Which I've just put the URL. I have a tiny URL set up to like redirect to the link. This is an open access resource from Taylor and Francis, which is part of Routledge, called what was our final title? Brokering and Research Practice Partnerships or something like that. But the gist of the book was trying to focus on what are the activities that brokers do in order to facilitate research use. And we've broken it up into things they do to help support individual people in their work using research and to support partnerships. And so there's a ton of examples in there about exactly the kind of thing you were just describing around how to bring people together and help them make meaning from data and build real relationships. It's focused specifically on research practice partnerships, but the skills are pretty universal, I think, and the examples are pretty universal. You would easily see how they would apply if you think of the partnership as being like between the data team and the superintendent's office or something like that. So the people who worked on, there's the National Network of Education Research Practice Partnerships called NERP, which is like the worst acronym in the world. But they were the ones who sponsored this, because if you're working anything like this, where you're working across different ways of working in the world, and it, like I said, it could be the data team and the program team within a district, or it could be, you know, a school district and an external research partner, an external nonprofit partner. Somebody's got to be able to speak both languages to get people to work together. And I think it's really an undervalued role. If you just have a researcher and a practitioner and neither of them have the skills to connect across, it will not go anywhere. You'll not actually be able to use your data. It doesn't have to be like a single person's job. It could be that it's skills that everyone has in a more diffuse way, but someone has to be attending to things like making sure that we make space to interpret findings, making sure that we're asking the right questions of the data in the first place. They're actually going to matter, that kind of stuff. That was my whole little job.
Thanks, Carrie. Thanks, Samantha. All right, here's the question. I'm going to put it in the chat too, so it's easy to refer back to, but how will artificial intelligence impact the use of data in research and evaluation? Or maybe even how has it impacted so far? In particular, what can one do to prevent the misinformation generated by AI from invalidating one's research and evaluation?
Yeah, I was interested in answering this because I had a really interesting experience with some students in the spring, where this is the first semester. I teach a course called Making Data Count. That's about, it's basically my book. It's sort of how to, not so much like how to calculate numbers, but like what question should you ask of the data and what do you do with the answer to make sure it has an impact. And the final project students have to do, I mean, they have a bunch of options, but essentially using existing research and or their own data analysis to make a recommendation of some kind. And I had a student who was trying to find research on, the language she was using was teacher turnover. She was interested in the issue of teacher turnover and wanted to find out like evidence-based strategies for improving that. And she'd been using like our normal search engines, like the Harvard Library System and that kind of thing. And I said to her, you know what, try putting in ChatGPT, synthesize the literature on teacher turnover. And first of all, it actually did a pretty good job of pulling out, I happen to know something about that topic. And so reading, I was like, yeah, those are pretty reasonable conclusions. More importantly, she realized that the reason she couldn't find anything was because in that field, the words people would use would be teacher retention rather than turnover. And so just having that like 30-second ChatGPT inquiry helped her get faster to the research she was interested in. So that's the plus side. The downside is if you then, like, let's suppose you say, synthesize the research literature, and then you say, give me citations, it's gobbledygook. Like they are literally not real things. They'll often have like a real journal title. Sometimes a researcher who's working in the field is the author, but the rest of it is literally made up hallucination. So that's where we are with AI in terms of using research right now. I think it is very helpful. Like I could imagine, who was the person who asked the special ed question? I think it was
Francis.
Oh, no, it wasn't Francis. It was someone, Chelsea. That Chelsea might be able to go there and say, like, you know, tell me more about what we know from research about strategies for intervening with kids with moderate autism or something. It would probably give you an okay answer to that, but it will not help you at all on knowing what research actually leads to those conclusions. So that's sort of the up and the down side. I don't think it's a sufficient answer to just use ChatGPT, but it at least can help you get started to know where to look to find like the right search term, the right set of maybe authors that are working in the field. But then you got to still do some legwork still. And I don't know of AI tools that can really do data analysis. I'm thinking more here of like looking at existing research literature.
I saw an article about someone who, or like a paralegal who tried to do, did you see that? That it brought up fake cases for the brief.
Yep, and no one checked to see if there
Right.
were real cases. Yeah, that was embarrassing.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Maybe in another 2 or 3 years, we can get rid of lawyers. I don't know. We'll find out. All right, we've
All
time for
right.
one more if somebody has it, but I don't see any hands.
Yeah. It looks like at least the questions for now have been answered. Carrie, thank you so much. This was wonderful. Really great presentation and conversation. We will be sending out a follow-up email next week with a copy of this recording and also with some of the resources that were noted today, including Carrie's new book. That's super exciting. And thank you again all for being here. And Carrie just dropped her information into the chat, and we'll also include that in the email. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Bye, everyone.